The bustling Chicago O'Hare International Airport was packed with its usual mix of hurried travelers that cold December morning. Flight 247 to Phoenix was boarding, and among the passengers was police officer Tom Wilson, a 15-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department, heading to Arizona for a law enforcement conference. As passengers settled into their seats, Wilson couldn't help but notice the woman sitting in 23B. His years of police work had trained him to be observant, and something about her demeanor caught his attention. She was in her mid-40s, wearing a simple blue sweater and jeans, but what struck him most was how she kept wiping away tears while tightly clutching a wrinkled photograph. Most passengers were either sleeping, reading, or absorbed in their phones, but Wilson kept glancing at the woman. Her hands were trembling, and every few minutes, she would look at the photo and quickly put it away, as if the image was too painful to bear. 20 years on the force had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, they were telling him something wasn't right. The flight took off smoothly, and once they reached cruising altitude, Wilson noticed the woman's anxiety seemed to increase. She kept checking her phone, then putting it away, her leg bouncing nervously. Other passengers had started to notice too, throwing concerned glances her way. After about 30 minutes in the air, when the seatbelt sign went off, Wilson decided he needed to check on her. As a police officer, even off-duty, he felt responsible for ensuring everyone's safety. He carefully made his way to her row, conscious not to appear threatening. "Ma'am," he said gently, showing his badge discreetly, "I'm Officer Wilson with the Chicago PD. I couldn't help but notice you seemed distressed. Is everything okay?" The woman's reaction was immediate and defensive. Her eyes widened with fear, and she quickly tried to hide the photograph she'd been holding. "I'm fine," she said sharply, her voice trembling. "Please leave me alone." But Wilson's experienced eyes caught sight of what looked like a young man's face in the photograph before she could hide it. The woman's defensive behavior and emotional state only heightened his professional concerns. In his experience, such reactions often indicated something serious. "I'm not here to cause any trouble," he assured her, keeping his voice low and calm. "I just want to make sure you're safe and okay. Sometimes talking to someone can help." The other passengers nearby pretended not to listen, but Wilson could tell they were all ears. The woman looked around nervously, then back at Wilson's kind, weathered face. There was something in his expression that made her hesitate, a genuine concern that seemed to break through her defenses. She took a shaky breath, and tears started forming in her eyes again. "I'm flying to Phoenix," she whispered, her voice breaking, "to identify my son's body." The words hung heavy in the air between them. Wilson felt his heart sink. After years of delivering difficult news to families, he knew the pain he was witnessing was raw and real. But something about this situation felt different, and his instincts were telling him there was more to this story than met the eye. Little did either of them know that this chance encounter at 30,000 feet was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about this situation. As Wilson settled into the empty seat next to her, preparing to hear her full story, neither could have predicted how their lives were about to intertwine in the most remarkable way. The story was just beginning, and the truth that would unfold over the next few hours would prove that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the most unexpected light. This first part sets up the story's foundation while maintaining suspense and emotional engagement. The language is simple yet impactful, and the narrative flows naturally while building intrigue for what's to come. As the plane cruised through the clouds, the woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Baker, began sharing her heartbreaking story with Officer Wilson. Her hands trembled as she finally showed him the photograph she'd been clutching. A young man with bright eyes and a gentle smile, taken about 12 years ago. "This was the last photo I have of him," she said softly, her fingers tracing the edges of the worn picture. "He was just 16 then. Such a good kid, you know? Always helping others, dreaming of becoming a teacher." Her voice cracked as she continued, but then things changed. We lost his father to cancer, and everything fell apart. Wilson listened intently as she described how her son had started hanging out with the wrong crowd after his father's death. The grief had been too much for both of them to handle. First, it was just skipping school, then came the minor troubles with the law, and finally, the discovery that changed everything. She found drugs in his backpack. I tried everything, Mrs. Baker continued, wiping away tears with a tissue Wilson had offered her. Counseling, rehabilitation programs, tough love, nothing seemed to work. He kept saying he could stop whenever he wanted, but things just got worse. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, making the overhead bins rattle. Mrs. Baker gripped the armrest tightly, taking a moment to collect herself before continuing. A flight attendant passed by, offering them water, sensing the heaviness of their conversation. "The last time I saw him was during a huge fight," she said, accepting the water with shaking hands. "He had stolen money from my purse. When I confronted him, he stormed out. I thought," she paused, taking a sip of water, "I thought he'd come back like he always did. But he didn't. That was 12 years ago." Wilson noticed other passengers trying not to stare, some discreetly wiping away their own tears as they couldn't help but overhear parts of the conversation. The raw emotion in Mrs. Baker's voice touched everyone within earshot. "I never stopped looking for him," she continued, pulling out her phone to show Wilson a series of old missing person posts and social media searches. "Every birthday, every Christmas, I'd post his photo online, hoping someone had seen him. Last week, I finally got a call from the Phoenix Police Department." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "They found a body behind a convenience store. They said he had an old ID on him that matched my son's name. They need me to identify." She couldn't finish the sentence. Wilson felt his stomach tighten. Something about her story triggered a memory, but he couldn't quite place it. He'd spent 3 months in Phoenix last year, working with their homeless outreach program as part of a police exchange initiative. During that time, he'd met dozens of young men struggling with addiction, each with their own story of loss and separation. "Mrs. Baker," he said carefully, "did the Phoenix police tell you anything else about the person they found? Any distinguishing marks or features?" She shook her head, "Just that he had my son's old ID. They said the body was found near Central Avenue, behind the Quick Stop. That he'd been there for about a week before someone noticed." Wilson's heart started beating faster. The location she mentioned, the timing, something wasn't adding up. He remembered a specific case from his time in Phoenix, one that had stuck with him because of its unusual circumstances. Could it be connected? As the plane continued its journey westward, Wilson found himself pulled deeper into a mystery that seemed to grow more complex with each passing minute. The coincidences were too striking to ignore, and a nagging feeling in his gut told him that this story was about to take an unexpected turn. Little did Mrs. Baker know that her tears on this flight might have been shed for a very different reason than she imagined. As Wilson pieced together his memories from Phoenix with her story, he realized he needed to proceed very carefully with what he was about to share. This second part deepens the emotional connection while building suspense about Wilson's potential knowledge. The narrative maintains its human element while setting up for the upcoming revelation. The plane had reached its cruising altitude, and the afternoon sun streamed through the small windows, casting long shadows across the aisle. Officer Wilson sat quietly for a moment, carefully considering his next words. His mind raced back to his time in Phoenix, specifically to a rainy evening 3 months ago. "Mrs. Baker," he began gently, "the reason I'm asking about distinguishing marks is because something about your story sounds familiar. During my time in Phoenix last year, I worked with their homeless outreach program. There was this young man I met. He had a small star-shaped birthmark behind his right ear. Did your son have anything like that?" Mrs. Baker's eyes widened in shock. Her hand flew to her mouth as she gasped, Yes, he did. How did you?" She leaned forward, her voice urgent and trembling. Did you meet him? Did you know my boy? Wilson pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his photos. His hands were steady, but his heart was racing. He knew he had to handle this situation delicately. False hope could be devastating, but if his suspicions were correct. 3 months ago, I was doing a night patrol near Central Avenue, he explained, still searching through his phone. It was pouring rain, and we found several people trying to stay dry behind some buildings. One young man caught my attention because he was helping an elderly homeless man share his umbrella. Mrs. Baker listened intently, hardly daring to breathe. The other passengers nearby had given up pretending not to listen, completely invested in the unfolding story. Despite his own situation, he was looking out for others. Wilson continued. It reminded me of what you just said about your son wanting to be a teacher. When we got to talking, he mentioned he was from Chicago, but he wouldn't tell me his real name. He was using the name Tommy. Wilson finally found what he was looking for on his phone. He paused before showing it to Mrs. Baker, knowing this moment could change everything. The thing is, Mrs. Baker, the young man I've met isn't dead. In fact, he's very much alive. He turned his phone toward her, showing a photo of a group of people outside a rehabilitation center. In the middle of the group stood a man in his late 20s, thin but healthy looking, with the same gentle smile from her old photograph. Mrs. Baker's hands shook as she took the phone, her eyes filling with fresh tears. That's him, she whispered. That's my boy. When was this taken? 2 weeks ago, Wilson replied softly. After I met him that rainy night, I managed to convince him to try a new rehabilitation program. He's been clean for almost 3 months now. He's been working with the program's job placement service, and Wilson paused, choosing his words carefully. He's been trying to find you. The revelation hung in the air like a physical presence. Other passengers were openly wiping away tears now, moved by the unexpected turn of events. A flight attendant who had been listening nearby quickly brought over a fresh box of tissues. But the body they found? Mrs. Baker asked, confusion mixing with hope in her voice. Someone else must have had his old ID, Wilson explained. It happens sometimes. IDs get lost, stolen, or given away on the streets. Mrs. Baker, your son is alive, and he's doing better than he has in years. The woman who had boarded the plane, believing she was flying to identify her dead son, was now trembling with the knowledge that she was actually flying toward a miracle. The tears that had started as grief were now flowing from overwhelming joy and hope. Wilson reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card. This is the address and phone number of the rehabilitation center. I've been keeping in touch with the staff there. They told me last week that your son had just celebrated 90 days sober. This third part delivers the emotional turning point while maintaining suspense about the upcoming reunion. The narrative stays grounded in realistic details while building toward the story's resolution. The atmosphere in the plane had completely transformed. What began as a somber journey had turned into something entirely different. Mrs. Baker kept looking at the photo on Wilson's phone, touching the screen gently as if she could reach through it and touch her son's face. He looked so different, yet exactly the same, she said softly, studying every detail of her son's face in the picture. His eyes, they have that spark again, the one I remember from before everything went wrong. Wilson nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The rehabilitation program he's in is one of the best in Phoenix. They don't just focus on getting clean. They help people rebuild their entire lives. Your son has been working with a counselor to deal with his grief over losing his father. A gentle ding sounded as the fasten seatbelt sign came on. The pilot's voice announced they were experiencing some turbulence, but Mrs. Baker barely seemed to notice. She was too absorbed in hope. The last time I saw him, she shared, her voice stronger now, he was so angry, so lost. I used to lie awake at night, wondering if I should have done something different. Maybe if I hadn't confronted him about the money that day. Wilson leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. "Mrs. Baker, you did what any good parent would do. Your son understands that now. In fact, during one of our conversations, he told me his biggest regret was putting you through all that pain." Other passengers who had been following their conversation let out small sighs of relief. An elderly woman across the aisle reached over and patted Mrs. Baker's hand, sharing in her joy. "But I don't understand something," Mrs. Baker said, wiping her eyes. "If he's been trying to find me, why haven't I heard from him? I've had the same phone number, the same address all these years." Wilson explained gently. "He's been afraid. The counselors told me he wanted to have something to show for himself before reaching out. He wanted to prove to you that he'd really changed this time. He's not just clean. He's been taking computer coding classes at the center. He's already completed 2 certification courses." Mrs. Baker laughed through her tears. "He always was good with computers. Even as a kid, he could fix anything electronic in the house." Her face turned serious again. "Officer Wilson, what should I do when we land? Should I go straight to the center? What if he's not ready to see me?" Wilson smiled reassuringly. "Actually, I have an idea about that. Would you mind if I made a quick call when we land? I know the program director well. Maybe we can arrange something that won't overwhelm him." The flight attendant who had been listening to their conversation approached with fresh coffee for both of them. "I couldn't help but overhear," she said warmly. "This is like something out of a movie. To think you were heading there thinking the worst, and instead—" She shook her head in amazement. Mrs. Baker took a sip of her coffee, her hands steadier now. "I keep thinking this is a dream, that I'll wake up and—" "It's not a dream," Wilson assured her. "But I'd suggest taking things one step at a time. Recovery is a journey, not a destination. The fact that he's working so hard, not just getting clean, but building a future, that says a lot about where he is now." As the plane continued its descent toward Phoenix, Mrs. Baker pulled out her old photograph again. But this time, instead of tears of grief, her eyes shone with hope. The picture was no longer a painful reminder of what she had lost, but a bridge to what she might regain. "Thank you," she whispered to Wilson. "Thank you for being on this flight today. Of all the planes, all the seats." Wilson smiled, thinking about how sometimes the universe works in mysterious ways. The story wasn't over yet. In many ways, it was just beginning. But at least now, both mother and son would have a chance to write the next chapters together. This 4th part maintains the emotional depth while building anticipation for the upcoming reunion, keeping the narrative grounded in realistic human experiences and emotions. The plane began its final descent into Phoenix, and the sprawling desert city came into view through the windows. As they got closer to landing, Officer Wilson pulled out his phone and started making some quick notes, formulating a plan that would make this reunion as smooth as possible for both mother and son. "The center where your son is staying," he explained to Mrs. Baker, "has a small coffee shop attached to it. It's run by the residents as part of their job training program. He works there 3 mornings a week." Wilson paused, checking his watch. "If we time this right, he should be there today." Mrs. Baker clutched her purse tightly, her knuckles white with nervousness. Do you think he'll want to see me?" The confidence she had felt earlier was now mixing with anxiety as the reality of the situation sank in. The plane touched down smoothly, and as other passengers began gathering their belongings, several of them offered words of encouragement to Mrs. Baker. A young woman who had been sitting 2 rows ahead turned around and shared, "My brother went through something similar. Trust me, your son wants to see you just as much as you want to see him." As they made their way through the terminal, Wilson noticed Mrs. Baker's hands shaking as she tried to check her makeup in a small mirror. "You look fine," he assured her gently. "Remember, he's probably just as nervous about seeing you." While waiting for their bags, Wilson made a quick phone call to the rehabilitation center. His face broke into a smile as he listened to the person on the other end. Turning to Mrs. Baker, he said, Good news. He's at work right now, and they say he's been doing exceptionally well today. The program director thinks this might be the perfect time. They caught a taxi outside the airport, and during the ride, Mrs. Baker shared more stories about her son's childhood, his love for building model airplanes, how he used to make breakfast for her every Mother's Day, the time he spent hours fixing an elderly neighbor's computer for free. Those qualities, Wilson said, they never went away. Even when I met him on the streets, he was still helping others. That's what caught my attention in the first place. The taxi turned onto a quiet street lined with desert plants and modern buildings. The rehabilitation center stood at the end of the block, a welcoming two-story structure with large windows and a small cafe visible from the street. There it is, Wilson pointed. The coffee shop is called Fresh Start Cafe. It's quite popular in the neighborhood. People come not just for the coffee, but because they want to support the program. As they got closer, Mrs. Baker could see several customers sitting at outdoor tables under large umbrellas. The morning sun cast a warm glow over the scene, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air. Wilson turned to Mrs. Baker before they got out of the taxi. "Are you ready for this?" he asked gently. "We can take a moment if you need it." She took a deep breath, smoothing her sweater with trembling hands. "I've been ready for 12 years, she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I just never thought I'd get the chance." Through the cafe windows, they could see a young man behind the counter, carefully crafting a latte. His back was turned to them, but Mrs. Baker recognized his stance, the way he held his shoulders, just like his father used to. "He looks busy," Wilson observed. "That's good. Keeping busy has been a big part of his recovery. The staff says he's one of their most reliable employees." As they stepped out of the taxi into the warm Phoenix morning, Mrs. Baker paused for a moment. "Officer Wilson," she said, turning to face him, "how can I ever thank you for this? If you hadn't been on that plane." Wilson smiled warmly. "Sometimes we're exactly where we need to be, even if we don't know why at the time. Now, shall we go get some coffee?" This fifth part builds anticipation for the reunion while maintaining emotional depth and adding sensory details to make the scene come alive. The Fresh Start Cafe was buzzing with morning activity. The smell of freshly ground coffee beans and warm pastries filled the air as Wilson and Mrs. Baker stepped inside. The cafe had a warm, inviting atmosphere with local artwork on the walls and small potted succulents on each table. Wilson gently guided Mrs. Baker to a table near the window, positioned where they could see the counter but weren't immediately visible to the staff. "Let me go up first," he suggested quietly. "I'll order our drinks and let the program director know we're here. We should do this carefully." Mrs. Baker nodded, unable to take her eyes off her son behind the counter. He was wearing a black apron and moving with confidence as he worked the espresso machine. His hair was neatly trimmed, and he had a healthy glow that comes from regular meals and peaceful sleep. A far cry from the troubled teenager who had walked away 12 years ago. As Wilson approached the counter, he could hear her son explaining the different coffee roasts to a customer with patience and enthusiasm. His voice was clear and steady, showing no signs of the struggles he'd faced on the streets. When the customer thanked him and left with their coffee, Wilson stepped up to order. "Officer Wilson," her son exclaimed, genuine pleasure in his voice. "I didn't know you were back in Phoenix. How are you?" The two men shook hands warmly across the counter. "I'm doing well," Wilson replied with a smile. "The coffee smells amazing today. How about 2 of your special lattes?" He glanced back at Mrs. Baker's table, but she was partially hidden behind a large potted plant. "Coming right up," her son said, reaching for the coffee beans. As he worked, he shared proudly, "You know, I got my 3rd certification last week. The program director says I might be ready for an internship at a tech company soon." Wilson watched him work, noting how his hands were steady and sure. "That's fantastic news. Actually, There's someone here who'd love to hear all about your progress. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Someone who's been waiting a very long time to see you again. The young man's hands froze over the espresso machine. His voice dropped to a whisper. Officer Wilson, what do you mean? Your mother is here, Wilson said gently. She's sitting right over there, and she'd really like to talk to you, but only if you're ready. The color drained from the young man's face as he looked up, his eyes scanning the cafe until they landed on the table where his mother sat. Their eyes met across the room, and time seemed to stand still. Mrs. Baker stood up slowly, her legs shaking. Neither of them moved for what felt like an eternity. The busy cafe seemed to fade away around them, leaving only mother and son, separated by 12 years and 20 feet of floor space. The program director, who had been watching from nearby, quietly stepped behind the counter. Go on, she said softly to the young man. Take all the time you need. I'll cover for you. He untied his apron with trembling hands, hanging it on a hook. As he stepped out from behind the counter, his mother took a hesitant step forward. Then another. They met in the middle of the cafe, both frozen in uncertainty. Mom. His voice cracked, sounding suddenly like the teenager he'd been when he left. Is it really you? Mrs. Baker reached up, her hand hovering near his face, almost afraid to touch him. My boy, she whispered. My beautiful boy. The entire cafe had gone quiet, watching this moment unfold. Then, as if a dam had broken, they fell into each other's arms. The sound of their tears, tears of joy, tears of relief, tears of lost years found again, filled the quiet space. Wilson watched from the counter, his own eyes misty. Sometimes, he thought, his job wasn't just about enforcing the law. Sometimes, it was about being in the right place at the right time, about helping broken pieces find their way back together. This 6-part captures the emotional intensity of the first reunion moment while keeping the narrative grounded and authentic. As mother and son held each other in the middle of Fresh Start Cafe, other customers quietly slipped away from nearby tables, giving them space for their reunion. The program director brought over 2 chairs, and Wilson quietly set down the lattes he'd ordered, stepping back to give them privacy. I'm so sorry, Mom, the young man said as they finally sat down, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry for everything. The money, the lies, running away. He couldn't seem to stop the words now that they'd started flowing. Mrs. Baker reached across the table and took his hands in hers. I'm sorry, too, she said softly. Sorry I couldn't find a way to help you back then. Sorry you felt you had to leave. She squeezed his hands. But you're here now. You're really here. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. I wanted to call so many times, he admitted, especially on your birthday, on Christmas, but I was ashamed. I didn't want you to see what I'd become. And now? She asked gently, her eyes taking in every detail of his face, noting how much healthier he looked than in Wilson's photo from 3 months ago. A small smile crossed his face. Now I'm starting to become someone you could be proud of again. He gestured around the cafe. I haven't missed a single day of work. I'm learning to code just like I always wanted to. I'm even teaching some of the newer residents how to use the espresso machine. Mrs. Baker smiled through her tears. I've always been proud of you, she said. Even when I was worried sick, even when I was angry or scared. I was proud of the good heart I knew you had. From behind the counter, Wilson watched as they began sharing stories, filling in the gaps of 12 lost years. He noticed how the son's shoulders gradually relaxed, how Mrs. Baker's hands stopped shaking. The program director brought over fresh coffee and some muffins, setting them down quietly. Remember that old computer you fixed for Mrs. Wilson next door? Mrs. Baker asked, laughing softly. She still talks about it. She kept that computer running for 8 more years after you fixed it. Her son's eyes lit up at the memory. Really? I was just thinking about that the other day. We have a computer literacy program here at the center, and I've been helping some of the older residents learn basic skills. It reminded me of Mrs. Wilson. You always did have a gift for teaching, his mother said warmly. Then her face grew serious. When the police called about the body they found, I thought I'd lost my chance to ever tell you how much I love you. He reached for her hand again. Mom, about that. I lost my ID years ago. I never thought. He shook his head. I'm so sorry you had to go through that fear. Wilson, who had been keeping a respectful distance, approached their table. Sometimes the worst moments can lead us to the best ones, he said quietly. If you hadn't been on that flight today, heading to identify a body, we might never have made this connection. The young man looked up at Wilson gratefully. When you found me that rainy night, I thought you were just another cop trying to clear the streets. But you talked to me like a person. You listened. You cared. Mrs. Baker stood up and hugged Wilson, taking him by surprise. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for saving my son twice. Once on that rainy night, and again on the plane today. The morning sun streamed through the cafe windows, casting a warm glow over the scene. Outside, life in Phoenix continued as usual, but inside Fresh Start Cafe, a family was beginning to heal, one conversation at a time. This seventh part delves deeper into the emotional reconciliation while maintaining authenticity and hope in the narrative. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cafe floor as mother and son continued sharing stories. The initial shock of their reunion had mellowed into comfortable conversation, though their eyes still shone with happy tears whenever they caught each other's gaze. Would you like to see where I live now? The young man asked hesitantly. It's not much, but I share an apartment with another program graduate. We both work here at the cafe. He glanced at the program director, who nodded her approval. Wilson, who had been quietly working on his laptop nearby, looked up. I can give you both a ride if you'd like. I've got a rental car waiting outside. As they walked to the parking lot, Mrs. Baker noticed her son greeting several people along the way. Elderly neighbors, local business owners, even a mail carrier. All of them responding with genuine warmth. It was clear he had become a valued part of this community. This is my neighborhood now, he explained proudly as they drove through quiet streets lined with desert plants. See that library over there? I volunteer there twice a week, helping kids with their computer homework. And that park? We have community meetings there every Sunday. They pulled up to a modest apartment complex with well-maintained gardens. His second-floor apartment was small but tidy, with a computer desk in one corner covered in textbooks and certification manuals. A small cactus garden flourished on the balcony. This is my study corner, he said, showing them his workspace. I've been learning JavaScript and Python. The program director thinks I might be ready for an entry-level programming job soon. He picked up a framed certificate from the desk. This is my latest certification. Mrs. Baker ran her fingers over the frame, reading the achievement with pride. Your father would have been so proud, she said softly. He always said you had a brilliant mind for technology. Her son grew quiet at the mention of his father. I think about him a lot, he admitted, especially now that I'm sober. The counselors here helped me understand that I was trying to run away from that grief instead of facing it. Wilson, who had been standing near the door, spoke up. Grief can make us do things we never thought we'd do. The important thing is that you're facing it now. They moved to the small living room, where a corkboard hung on the wall filled with photos of smiling people, other residents, program staff, and community members. In the center was the photo Wilson had taken 3 months ago outside the rehabilitation center. These are my new friends, he explained. My support system. They've become like family. He paused, looking at his mother. But they're not you, Mom. I missed you every single day. Mrs. Baker reached out and touched one of the photos. Tell me about them, she said. I want to know about the people who helped my son find his way back. As he began sharing stories about each person on the board, Wilson noticed how his voice grew stronger, more confident. This wasn't just a story of recovery. It was a story of rebuilding, of creating a life filled with purpose and connection. The program director had given him the rest of the day off, and as afternoon turned to evening, mother and son made plans for the days ahead. Mrs. Baker would stay in Phoenix for a week, giving them time to rebuild their relationship slowly and thoughtfully. "Mom," he said suddenly, "would you like to come to my support group meeting tomorrow? I've talked about you so many times there. They'd love to meet you." Mrs. Baker wiped away fresh tears. "I'd be honored," she said. "I want to know everything about your new life here. Every single part of it." Wilson watched from his spot by the window as they continued planning their week together. Sometimes, he thought, his job brought him to exactly where he needed to be. Today, it had brought him to a moment of healing that would ripple out to touch many lives. This 8th part explores the son's new life while deepening the emotional reconnection between mother and son, maintaining hope while acknowledging the work still ahead. As the evening settled over Phoenix, Officer Wilson prepared to leave mother and son to their reunion. The desert sky had turned a beautiful shade of purple and orange, marking the end of a day that had started with tears of sorrow and ended with tears of joy. "Before I go," Wilson said, reaching into his pocket, "I have something for both of you." He pulled out 2 business cards. "My direct number is on the back. I'd like to keep in touch, if that's okay. It's not every day we get to be part of a miracle." The young man stood up from his spot on the couch. "You know, Officer Wilson, I've been thinking about what happened that rainy night. Most people would have just told us to move along, but you stopped to talk. You saw me as a person, not just another problem to solve." Mrs. Baker nodded in agreement. And today on the plane, of all the flights, all the seats, it wasn't just chance, was it? Wilson smiled warmly. "In my 20 years on the force, I've learned that sometimes we're meant to be exactly where we are, even if we don't understand why at the time." The program director had stopped by earlier with some homemade lasagna for their dinner, and the smell filled the small apartment with a homey warmth. Mother and son had already made plans for the week: support group meetings, a tour of the neighborhood, dinner with his roommate, and quiet moments just to talk. "You know what I'm most proud of?" the young man said, looking at his mother. "Not just getting clean, but staying clean. Every day, I make a choice to be better than I was yesterday. And now, knowing you're here," his voice cracked slightly, "it makes me want to work even harder." Mrs. Baker reached out and squeezed his hand. "We'll take it one day at a time, together. I want to learn everything about this new life you've built. Every small victory, every challenge." As Wilson prepared to leave, he watched them from the doorway. The fearful woman from the plane and the troubled young man from that rainy night had both transformed. In their place sat a mother and son, beginning the delicate work of rebuilding their relationship. "Oh, one more thing," Wilson said, turning back. "The Phoenix Police Department runs a youth outreach program. Once you're ready, we could use someone who understands both sides of the story. Someone who can connect with kids who might be heading down a difficult path." The young man's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "You mean, use my experience to help others?" "Exactly," Wilson nodded. "But first, focus on your reunion, your recovery, and your coding classes. The rest will fall into place." As Wilson walked to his car, he could hear their laughter floating down from the second-floor apartment. He thought about all the twists and turns that had led to this moment: a rainy night, a chance encounter, a heartbreaking misunderstanding, and finally, a reunion that seemed nothing short of miraculous. Driving away, he glanced in his rearview mirror. Mother and son stood on the balcony, waving goodbye. The small cactus garden behind them was blooming with unexpected flowers. A perfect symbol, he thought, of how beauty can grow in the most unlikely places. Tomorrow, they would begin the real work of healing. There would be difficult conversations, painful memories to process, and trust to rebuild. But tonight, they had something they'd lost 12 years ago: hope. And sometimes, Wilson thought as he turned onto the main road, hope is the most powerful force for change we have. It can transform a rainy night into a new beginning, a grieving mother into a joyful one, and a lost son into a found man with a future full of promise. This final part brings closure to the story while leaving room for hope and future growth, maintaining the human connection that has run throughout the narrative.